Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to today's Race and Difference Colloquium. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Heidi Kim with us. Heidi Kim is professor of English and comparative literature at UNC Chapel Hill, where she also directs the Asian American Center, which opened last year in 2020. Her research ranges widely over 20th century US literature and Asian American studies, from rereading the canon to new archival research on the Japanese American incarceration and reparations. Her most recent book, Illegal Immigrants, Model Minorities, The Cold War of Chinese American Narrative, which was published earlier this year by Temple University Press, examines the tandem rise of illegal immigration policing and the protective use of the model minority images. Her other books are Invisible Subjects, Asian America and Post-War Literature, which examines the presence of Asian figures in novels by Faulkner, Steinbeck, and others, and the edited volume taken from the Paradise Isle, the Hoshida family story, which pieces together the incarceration of a family from Hawaii during World War II. She's currently beginning a monograph about the long cultural history of Japanese American incarceration and reparations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Heidi Kim.
Thank you so much, Andra. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to the wonderful staff at the James Weldon Johnson Institute who have set this up. I also just enjoyed a really warm welcome from the JWJ Fellows, so thank you for that as well. I'm really delighted to be here today. When you publish a book, there are always so many things that you feel like you could still explore, and you only had so much space to do it in. So today's a chance for me to do some of that and to also link it to some of the concerns that have swirled in and around the Asian American community in the last year, which has obviously been a really difficult one. So in the last year, with all of the anti-Asian attacks, both verbal and physical, which of course culminated in the Atlanta shootings, which must have been tremendously difficult for your campus. I think that we as a whole have been re-scrutinizing the role and the depiction of Asian Americans. And I know that on my campus, and I believe on yours as well, there's been a real hard look at this term model minority and the way that it pigeonholes Asian Americans, the way that it constrains a lot of Asian American students in particular. And likewise, for me as somebody who has been studying the twofold construction of this binary of illegal immigrant and model minority, I was really also looking at the way that illegality, foreignness, otherness was implicated in the media coverage of anti-Asian violence. And I think you did see that a lot around the shootings in Atlanta. This, kind of uncertainty as to whether these people counted as American or whether they were foreign, and a lot of the insinuations about sex work. So this is something that I think is still a very important debate for us today. Now, I am going to share some screens so that you don't have to look at my face the whole time. All right. So as we think about the model minority, this is something that has been really heavily studied of late in Asian American studies. And a lot of these studies have come out of sociology and psychology, have really focused on the impact of the continuation of the model minority framework. And I use that word framework because people refer to the model minority very differently as an image, a myth, and now as an identity that many Asian Americans have taken on, sometimes really embraced. So in terms of sociological study, this has really heavily focused on education. And sociologists Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou have come up with the idea of the success frame, which for Asian Americans is very heavily based on educational success and entry into particular professions, medical being one of them. Pavan Dhingra published a tremendous book on model minority parenting, which he called an arms race, thereby linking it back to other forms of neoliberalism, and maintained that this is very much a part of the neoliberal education system. And his book does not exclusively focus on Asian Americans, but they are certainly included. And Shalini Shankar wrote a book focusing on spelling bees, but actually took a kind of subversive approach to the model minority image, saying that these spelling bee champs are not just model minorities, but that they are learning crucial new skills that are outside of the stereotypical frame, like self-promotion, self-direction, Gen Z skills, really. And in terms of the more psychological impact, Erin Quaid Nin has a new book looking at the affective reaction to the model minority identity. So what is the emotional investment that Asian Americans have in the model minority identity, and what are the feelings that they experience at various points along that trajectory, whether that's pride or shame or anything else. There's a really wonderful new book from David Eng and Shinhee Han. Shinhee Han is a clinical psychologist, and I really encourage this for folks on a college campus. And they suggest that the model minority is a melancholic mechanism, melancholic in the Freudian sense, that erases other identities and histories of discrimination and exclusion. So the model minority is really one of erasure, and that it emphasizes the economic framework and economic success at the expense of individual wellness. So it goes through many case studies, and again, it's really a terrific read. So what I, in my work, am looking at are these identities and histories that Eng and Han are saying have been erased by our modern conception of the model minority. So I, and also some other historians, notably Ellen Wu and Cindy Cheng, have been really looking back at what I call the proto-model minority era. So the era before the term was explicitly coined. That's also the era before the idea of Asian America was coined. So that's why my book is very ethnic specific, and these dialogues often tended to be ethnic specific. So that puts us in this time period where I contend the idea of the model minority is really set up in opposition to the idea and the words illegal immigrant, which are really becoming popular in that era. And I'm chiefly interested in how the model minority was actually wielded as a political tool by Asian Americans. So thinking about the roots of the model minority, when it was articulated in 1966, it was articulated in two very famous articles. So one was on the right in the New York Times Magazine, Success Story Japanese American Style, and one on the left from the News and World Report, the success story of one minority group in US. That group was the Chinese Americans. So it was set up about both ethnicities, and it's set up explicitly as a tool of anti-Blackness. So if you look at the paragraph on the left, what you see is this competitive kind of suffering and the idea that Chinese Americans have suffered more, and the implication of that being that they have overcome this racism. So it's very much a story of racism and exclusion and discrimination, but again, that is framed as something that they have successfully overcome in terms of economics, in terms of their own family structure. And so this is, I think, a very important thing for us to emphasize about the term model minority. So the original definition, as you glean it from these two articles, it depends very strongly on family, on educational achievement, which we still retain today in our definition of the model minority, economic uplift through hard work, so very much a kind of anti-welfare, anti-government assistance narrative. No juvenile delinquency, that's a term that's used a lot specifically. Very law-abiding adult population. quietly overcoming a history of racism on their own and pride in Americanness. So looking specifically at this idea of policing and this emphasis on a law-abiding kind of self-policing community construction, what this clashes with for me is the enormous growth of immigration policing in this era, which is heavily aimed at Chinese Americans, as well as, of course, Mexican Americans and Latin Americans, but an astonishing amount of the rhetoric around this focused on Chinese Americans. And likewise, the celebration of the family structure is very ironic because extended families are pathologized so much during immigration scrutiny. And then in this model minority definition, suddenly having strong extended families is seen as such a good thing because they're policing their children more. So it's very much around this language of self-policing. So historically, how did this come to be, this binary and this kind of dialectic between illegal immigrants and model minorities? Well, if you look at the post-World War II era, we're looking at a very small population. So by 1960, it's still only about 230,000 Chinese Americans in the entire country. So again, very small for the amount of attention that is focused on them. And we'll look at why and how that breaks down. So first of all, there's this kind of civil rights narrative of progress that is often discussed. So the gradual elimination of the alien land laws, which forbade people who were not citizens from owning land, the gradual elimination of anti-miscegenation law on the West Coast. This is before the Loving decision, of course. And then in 1943, Chinese naturalization is finally permitted. So prior to this, no Asians were permitted to naturalize in the 20th century. In 1946, Filipino and Indian naturalization is permitted. And in 1952, finally, other Asian ethnicities and national origins are permitted to naturalize. So again, this is usually told as a kind of tale of civil rights progress, but in true critical race theory fashion, I would characterize this as a very hollow progress, very negative progress. And what you see here is not the recognition or the establishment of a strong Asian American community or identity, but the elimination, the slow elimination of some facets of legal discrimination. And so for me, it's very qualified kind of progress. And you might ask, how could the government, if I'm looking at a history of government acts, how could the government establish anything about the Asian American identity? And the answer is, it is possible, right? So you see that later after the activism of the 70s, when, for example, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is established. So those are the kinds of things that I would measure on the other side. What we see at the same time is this enduring resistance to the entrance of more Asians into the United States. So the supposed 1952 immigration reform, the McCarran-Walter Act, actually did not really do much to allow more Asian Americans. It eliminated the previous nomenclature of the Asiatic barred zone, which was considered offensive by many. And it substituted a new term, the Asia-Pacific Triangle, which was defined by longitude and latitude. So that's just a veneer of new nomenclature. It created racial quotas rather than national quotas. This was seen as a more progressive move, but those quotas were pegged to existing population. So the idea was to maintain the racial composition of the United States. And likewise, there was that was paired with the desire to encourage assimilation and cultural cohesion. So this language of unassimilability, which had long circled around Asian Americans, continued to be deployed. And there were also some really concrete efforts to close down immigration. So one key one was placing time limits on what was called citizenship by derivation. So if there was a citizen parent, say a Chinese American man, usually in the US, who had perhaps, as was not uncommon then, gone to China, married a woman in China and had children there, there was an effort to close down the claiming of US citizenship by those children. So because all of this comes together with the loss of China, as it was called, in 1949 to communism, we also have to put this in conversation with, again, this enormous apparatus of immigration policing that grew up in this era. So the Drumright Report was a famous consular report from Hong Kong that suggested in 80 pages that the US needed to exclude Chinese communist agents or criminal elements. And one of the tools that was used by the US government at this time was mandatory paternity testing. So children who were entering the US would be blood typed, and the father who was claiming these children in the US would be blood typed. So they would be looking for mismatches, obviously. This broke with legal precedent, a long-standing and still observed legal precedent of presuming paternity within marriage. Usually the position of the law is not to question, essentially, the paternity of children who are born in wedlock. And so this really cut directly against mainstream standards of respecting the family. Likewise, the INS instituted a special Chinese confession program, which again was an effort to close what they called fraudulent slots. So if you admitted that, say that you were falsely documented, then they would be able to close down the slots of that person who had admitted you, and then they wouldn't let in, any children you claimed, and so on. So this was framed as a possible but uncertain path to citizenship, and indeed it did result in many deportations rather than a huge wave of naturalizations. So what about Chinese Americans in this time period? They are struggling to speak out and influence policy. So for example, there are protests from Chinatown family associations who had large symbolic conferences, sent cables to the president and to just about anyone they could think of. And you see they make this very broad claim here, whether intentional or otherwise, the government and its officials are having the effect of stigmatizing the social and family status of a respected community with criminal coloration. So that's where I really see Chinese Americans themselves using this binary, right? Claiming their law-abidingness, their good family status. In many cases, also, this is a class-based argument, and putting that in opposition to something that they're calling criminal. Now, there were even more radical folks within the Chinese American community who spoke out much more generally and said that, the reason that there's any falsely documented entrance is because of the US's longstanding discriminatory immigration policies. That was not the stand that most of the Chinese American community took. But there were certainly a couple of key folks, including one newspaper editor, who took that much more critical stance. And instead, we see these family associations really embracing, again, the Americanness that underpins that idea of model minority, patriotic, loyal, and law-abiding American citizens. So setting up, again, that search for the perfect plaintiff, in a sense. So the question was, this clearly had a limited effect on policy because the confession program continued for a long time. Paternity testing continued for a long time, despite Supreme Court cases. The Supreme Court case about that, by the way, was the first one argued by an Asian American lawyer. So another really interesting time point in history. The question was whether it could exert individual protection then. And so what I investigated in the book that came out earlier this year was the way that some of these public figures did really embrace the kind of proto-model minority stereotype in order to protect themselves and their own families. So this is a picture of Jade Snow Wong. Some of you may be familiar with her. Her memoir, Fifth Chinese Daughter, is still considered a classic of Asian American literature, and she was dubbed the mother of Asian American literature. She was very young when she wrote that memoir, and it really catapulted her into the public view. And she very carefully and very diligently concealed her mother's fraudulent immigration status until she died. And that was something she maintained for a lifetime. So it was something that was very personal to her. And that's why in my study of these eras, my goal is not to condemn anyone for the choices that they made, because they were all doing it under these extreme pressures, but really to understand the way that these narratives were working in opposition to each other. So today I'm going to take us into some new archival material that I didn't have a chance to explore in my book. And the reason that I'm going into this comic book world is because, again, I'm very interested in this interplay between culture and policy. Political scientists have demonstrated to us over and over again the correspondence between negative media images and policy. But sometimes we as cultural critics can't find a clear negative and positive, especially when there is a dialectical relationship between the two of them. So what happens then? I'm enlarging my archive here to Yellow Claw, which is a popular depiction. It's not Asian American authored. My book focused very much on Asian American authors and authorship. But if we're entertaining the idea that culture and policy exist in dialogue with each other, then I think it does behoove us to look very broadly at cultural depictions, especially very popular ones like this. So what is this? I'm sure you're all really enjoying this beautiful cover image. The Yellow Claw series was short-lived. It was part of Atlas Comics, which became Marvel Comics. And 4 issues of it came out in 1956 and 1957. It was stopped due to poor sales, essentially. And significantly, this coincides with the start of what's called the Silver Age of comic books, after the congressional investigation of their contribution to juvenile delinquency. So there's an interesting resonance, again, with the establishment of the model minority. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner of this cover, a little stamp that says approved by the Comics Code Authority. So that's the authority that the industry itself was able to set up to kind of, clean up its act, essentially. So at this time, comics are still hugely popular, and the Silver Age reintroduces superheroes in a big way. This particular story was created by a writer named Al Feldstein, who was known for taking on social issues in some of his work with other comics. And in general, it's a very simple oppositional story. The Yellow Claw is kind of a super wizard who is dug out of the mountains of China by the Chinese Communist Party. That's the opening of the first comic. And he agrees to work with them, but his secret goal is to take over the whole world. And he is continually opposed by Jimmy Woo, an FBI agent, who is in the lower right-hand corner. And so this is the introduction of Jimmy Woo, who still exists in continuity in the Marvel Cinematic Universe today. So, we'll get there. So they are somewhat interestingly positioned as illegal immigrant and model minority, because the Yellow Claw invades the US, goes straight to Chinatown, which is still today very much written about in the media as this place of undocumented immigration. He's a master of disguise, which is, of course, a familiar supervillain trope, but also harkens to some of the language that was used in immigration policing about essentially not being able to tell Chinese Americans apart, and how much more difficult that made it to police immigration. So he's leading microscopic armies, shadowy armies, mutant armies, all kinds of, your usual comics hijinks. And then there's Jimmy Woo on the right, who is barely Asian American at all. So what does it mean to be Asian American or Chinese American in a 1950s popular depiction? It doesn't mean much in this comic. He exists only as a foil for the Yellow Claw. He has very little independent or well-established identity of his own. We see his apartment once. We see him out of this suit and hat once in some kind of dressing gown that I was staring at, trying to figure out if it was supposed to be a Chinese dressing gown, but I think it's just a dressing gown. The comic also very quickly leaves the United States. So a lot of the action takes place across Asia and the Pacific. And there are a lot of mingled political threats that harken back to the fears of infiltration. So that the development of the idea of this Asia-Pacific region, this Asia-Pacific rim, and this Asia-Pacific triangle that is policed in immigration is created by this Cold War shift of political interests. So on the left, one of the comics takes place on the SS Aloha, so positioning Hawaii, which isn't a state yet, as this kind of place of otherness and Asianness. And another comic takes place on one of the atolls in the Pacific Ocean, where there are these mutant birds from the nuclear experiments who the Yellow Claw deploys against the Americans. But what this also speaks to is the inextricability of any kind of Asian American identity or depiction from foreign policy interests. So why can't Jimmy investigate anybody else? He has no special knowledge, he just kind of exists as a foil for the Yellow Claw. In another really striking image, the Yellow Claw creates Temujai, who is a robot with some Genghis Khan kind of iconography. And he is actually a robot planted in Malaysia. So you can see also there's some kind of Southeast Asian artistic influence. He's meant to unite all Asians against the West. So really speaking directly there to fears of communist takeover. And Jimmy, who by the way, never speaks any language other than English, voices Temujai and tells all the Asians essentially to go home and live in peace. This is 4 years after the Korean Armistice. And it's very reminiscent of Jade Snow Wong and other exemplary Asian Americans in this time period being sent on State Department goodwill tours through Asia to tout the values of democracy. So using the Asian American here to lead the Asians. Again, that's his chief role. There's very little actual racialization of Jimmy. The most significant racialization is that he exists in racialized space in the first story. So he goes to Chinatown to track down the Yellow Claw, and he's very comfortable. So here he's speaking to somebody who lives in Chinatown, all of whom are shown in very traditional Chinese garb, which would not have been accurate in the 1950s in any way. And he moves comfortably around in Chinatown. There's one reference to him walking along familiar streets. So that is the extent of his racialization. You also might note the art. If you look at the previous depiction of him, he's drawn just as this very generic kind of square-jawed hero with dark hair. Here, I think perhaps there's some more effort at depicting him in a kind of racialized way, but the artist really steered clear of that for the most part. And there's also the question of how we end things. Now, as I told you, the Yellow Claw just stopped. it didn't have a kind of long-lasting trajectory. But he, of course, has a love interest. His love interest is the Yellow Claw's niece, so a beautiful, exotic Asian woman. And we have to remember that the traditional means of stabilizing their identity for men of color in mainstream white America in this era is heterosexual marriage and children. So, for example, this was very important in the public image that was constructed for Jackie Robinson. And so the stress in the model minority image on properly procreating Chinese American families with a stress on American that are nice and nuclear, disciplining their children, romantically founded, but also non-threatening because they are not intermarrying. And so Jimmy Woo is pointed towards this kind of romantic union with a woman who's very Asian identified. And this was seen as, in Hollywood, the appropriate ending. So I've got a couple of lovely images for you here of The Phantom of Chinatown, which is one of the very few mystery films where a Chinese American actually got to play a detective. And that character's name is Jimmy Wong, so he probably is a direct inspiration for Jimmy Woo. And on the bottom, an image from the famous movie Flower Drum Song, which has been written about a great deal by Asian American studies critics, including myself, because the protagonist ends up marrying this woman who actually entered in an undocumented way. She smuggled herself in on a boat. And so I contend that this film actually leaves them in a very dicey place as far as their immigration status. And the cutting off of the Yellow Claw series also leaves us in a state of racial melancholia, in which Jimmy Woo can never fully achieve his American heroism. He can never kill the villain, who is his racial double. He can never get the girl. And notably, she is portrayed as very foreign, very other. And she's heavily identified with her uncle, the Yellow Claw. So this possible pairing, again, raises some anxieties similar to the one in Flower Drum Song, in which the protagonist on the right actually says at his own wedding, "I don't care if I get deported," right? Which is a tremendously ridiculous thing to say in the 1950s. So very much this kind of Hollywood romancing around the idea of love conquering all. But that's not even an option for Jimmy Woo. So he just has this kind of faint romantic interest, and one which never really satisfactorily resolves anything for him. Not, again, that it resolved anything for anyone else when it came to the movies. So there is no such thing as a kind of clear-cut ending then for Asian American men in particular in this era, in the way that they're being portrayed popularly. And that, I think, is a real concern for us to think about. So in Yellow Claw, when we have this complete bifurcation of the illegal immigrant, right, the evil Asian, and the model minority American, the villain, the supervillain, and the superhero, this leaves us in a place where only racial melancholia is possible. So it is impossible, obviously, for Yellow Claw ever to become the American hero. And it is impossible for the illegal immigrant to assert a full Americanness. Maxine Hong Kingston's writings in the 1970s and 1980s, in which she confronts the difficulty and the mystery of her family's origins, takes up the silence and the illegality, and to some extent her parents much more, as her rhetorical target. And David Eng has characterized this further as Kingston's melancholia, the impossibility of escaping the internalization of national erasure. However, I perhaps have some more faith than he does in the redemptive power of writing and activism, or writing as activism. And the structure of Kingston's memoir is designed, I think, to lead us in this hopeful direction as she ultimately swings her swords at racists in power rather than aiming all of her ire at her own family. But where does that leave us as far as looking at historical documents like this? Well, we see that these dialectical relationships, again, the illegal immigrant, the model minority, here, supervillain, superhero, that these can never be escaped. So that, like the citizen and the foreigner, the model minority and the illegal immigrant narratively almost cannot function without each other. So in the current Marvel Cinematic Universe, in which there is no Yellow Claw, Jimmy Woo, who's played by Randall Park, shown here, is a very minor character. He's largely comic relief, though he has moments of authority and insight. He's beloved, but he's far from being the protagonist. And that's why I am not so crazy about the celebratory possibilities of diversity in the MCU. As long as we adapt these works, we are chained to these 1950s binary origins. So, for example, we still can't have an Asian American superhero without an Asian villain, as in Shang-Chi. Black Panther was fascinating precisely because its politics were reversed as far as American citizenship status, but nonetheless, there still was not the Black hero without the Black villain, not to mention the storytelling device of the white man as the fish out of water in the Black Panther film. So this is something that recently bubbled up for me as I took some students to see Shang-Chi. And there, of course, there's also more to say about immigration, which I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A if anyone wants to, although I don't want to give any spoilers. I also want to connect these historical concerns, which I think carry through not only culturally, but I want to connect them to the politics of today. So thinking about the way that the model minority was used protectively against the stigma of illegal immigration, and not just the stigma, but the very real threat of investigation and deportation that hung over Chinese Americans in the 1950s, with, again, this tremendous buildup of immigration policing and this apparatus that we have to thank for our current immigration system today. We come to this question of where this binary stands today in the dialogue about undocumented folks, especially young people. So Theresa Lee, who was one of the poster children, almost literally, for the DREAM Act, and is one of the few really prominent Asian American undocumented advocates, was framed as recently as in the PBS documentary series Asian Americans, if you saw that, as very much the model minority. That, you know, what was so interesting to people about her and the reason that people wanted to help her was her tremendous musical ability. And she's now faculty at the Manhattan School of Music. And so even in that documentary, there was very much the adherence to this model of the perfect plaintiff, which comes from civil rights. And for example, the effort to find Rosa Parks, right, the most suitable, the most sympathetic plaintiff for legal cases. There were similar moves made throughout that 6-part documentary series, I think, in terms of focusing really heavily on exemplarity, focusing on a kind of model minority progression, and very much a civil rights triumphal narrative. But also, I would connect this to the entire way that the dialogue about undocumented children in particular has been constructed. So that the strictures of the Obama era DACA policy, deferred action for childhood arrivals, that memo, if you look at the language of that memo, explicitly outlines forgiveness only for the model minority. So you have to be in school, right? Obviously in good standing in school, or graduated, an honorably discharged veteran, or holding a general education certificate, not convicted of any serious crime. So not quite as strict, maybe, as some of the standards that the model minority might be held to in, say, Pavan Dhingra's book, about the arms race of education, but still laying out this way in which you have to earn forgiveness. And even these requirements, and even going beyond these requirements, were no longer enough by 2016 to be politically efficacious, as support for DACA rapidly eroded under the Trump administration and even during his campaign. So during the 2017 and 2018 debate that led up to the court-ordered continuation of the renewal of immigration status under DACA, the publicity surrounding exemplary young DACA recipients, including 2 Texas high school students who revealed their undocumented status during or after their valedictory addresses at their high school, was really exceptional. So on the right here, you see the tweet from Ms. Lara, who writes, valedictorian, 4.5 GPA, full tuition paid for at UT, 13 cords and medals. So very much the model minority stereotype. Nice legs, which by the way is also a facet of the model minority stereotype, not one that's talked about as explicitly. Oh, and I'm undocumented. And the response to this tweet was everything that you might expect of the gutter of social media, right? Calls for her to be deported, claims that she had stolen somebody else's scholarship, and so on. Now, obviously, the history and the racialization of the Latinx community is very different from Asian American community. I don't want you to think that I'm just making a kind of seamless transition here, but we are seeing this kind of same binary played with here for Theresa Lee and also for Maite Lara. So one Arizona congressman, during the blowback to these valedictorians' disclosures, one Arizona congressman said, the picture that's given to us is you've got a valedictorian. These are all valedictorians. They're all highly performing, highly achieving, but we don't know that. And so implicit in the dialogue is the idea that perhaps we ought to require all DACA recipients to be valedictorians, that we ought to move the goalposts again to require this extreme model minority status. And so the backlash that they received over these disclosures, especially from white community members, many of whom drew on their own disappointment about college admissions, right? So children who did not get into the University of Texas, and the rhetoric of attacks on affirmative action, which of course further implicate Asian Americans, suggests that we have reached the limits of the rhetorical efficacy of this type of discourse in as much as it was ever effective. So what I think the 1950s political roots show us is that the oppositional relationships between the model minority and the undocumented migrant today are at the root of this painful model minority consciousness that we're now studying in more psychological terms, precisely because its ability to protect and gain acceptance is so compromised from the very beginning. And furthermore, they show the essential fragility of the Asian American identity, which is grounded in a demonization and repudiation, not only of the undocumented, but of the Asian period, which is unsustainable and inhumane and belies the reality of our global labor flows and transnational lives. So I don't know the way out of this in terms of policy, but I think that a deeper understanding of these narratives is perhaps yet another way to help Asian Americans cast a reliance on them as a means of gaining acceptance and finding their own self-confidence. I'll stop there. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very, very much for such a wide-ranging, contextual, and just really, really important talk. So our lines are open. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A button to write your question, and I will read it to Dr. Kim. So this is from an anonymous attendee. Wow, is that last conclusion from your book or written somewhere? That was very powerful. I'd like to refer back to it.
Thank you. That's very kind. It's written in my slideshow notes, but I can tweet it out, so you've got a place to refer back to it if you like. And I'll just risk the blowback on Twitter. Thank you.
Any other questions? So this one is from one of our fellows, Sherry Mackinson. Great talk. Can you talk a bit more about the melancholy effect for those of us less familiar with Foucault?
Yeah, so the melancholia argument. So the person who wrote the book on this literally is Anne Cheng. And the idea is that Asian Americans, who she focuses on, but I think there are some comparisons with other groups, really end up existing in this state of melancholia in the Freudian sense, in that they can never really achieve their desire, right? That there's this kind of impossibility. So the way that I see that happening, again, with something like Yellow Claw, is that it's impossible for Jimmy Woo ever to kind of fully establish any kind of Asian Americanness, because he exists only in opposition to this kind of Asian supervillain, and you know, in a bit of a romantic entanglement with this Asian woman. And so there are just all of these kinds of impossibilities there for him to achieve anything that might be recognized as a kind of full Americanness. At the same time, as I said, it's a very strange little comic, because you could also say that he's barely even Asian American in the first place. You know, his name and the fact that he's willing to walk around Chinatown are really the two most important things about him. But I think that recent scholars have shown that, you know, space, the racialization of space is so important that we shouldn't discount that as a means of racializing Jimmy Woo. So sorry, I drifted a little bit there. But in terms of melancholia, the idea there is that, you know, we catch people up essentially in these impossible situations in which they can never really achieve a kind of model that is set out for them.
Thank you. It's another anonymous question. Do you think that Wanwoos character development, which is arguably deeper than most Marvel villains, ameliorates the critique of having an Asian hero and an Asian villain?
So I have a lot of thoughts about that movie. I think that, you know, certainly he's much more well-rounded than most. So I think that is important. I think that likewise in Black Panther, although it's not for me to say how that resonated with folks, you know, King Killer is a, is that his name?
Killmonger.
Killmonger is a much more well-rounded character, right, with really interesting motivations. And so I think that's good. I think that's important. What I actually think that they did in Shang-Chi is that they completely rewrote the Mandarin, right? So he's not even the Mandarin anymore. He's just Wenwu. In the comic books, he's the son of Fu Manchu. He is literally the son of the worst Asian supervillain stereotype that has ever shaped the view of Asian Americans in the US. And they just took that out, which again, I think is fine, right? I didn't really need to see that on screen. But what they did was they substituted a much more classic kind of conflict, father and son, right? And also a kind of immigrant and American child generation gap, right? So Asian parents, American child, right? Different ways of life, generation gap. So in some ways, they made it a little bit more of an Asian American story, but with a whole lot of caveats. I mean, I could keep going about this. That'll be a whole other talk. But in terms of the actual idea of having an Asian villain, I guess my answer is kind of yes and no. I think it is much richer, but you know, at the end of the day, it still is what it is. And when I see Shang-Chi in a standalone film fighting against a villain, a supervillain of another race, especially a white supervillain, then that I think will be the most significant change.
Thanks. So another question, powerful talk, thank you. Do you have any sense of how different Asian American populations were played off against each other? For example, South Asians versus East Asians during that time?
So the interesting thing here is that the dialogues were the national political dialogues were very ethnic specific. And so the history of these groups is so different that there wasn't actually that kind of dialogue. And you also don't see a whole lot of comparison of Chinese Americans, for example, or Chinese migrants to Mexican migrants, right? What you see is a lot of scattered, separate discussion. And again, different processes of racialization happening. South Asians, obviously, not to mention Southeast Asians, especially the Filipino community during this time period, are going through their own different process of racialization and acceptance. So as I noted, their naturalization actually happens separately, right? The legalization of Filipino and Indian naturalization happens separately because there are all of these different dialogues going on and different foreign policies revolving around those countries. So I think it's just a little too, I don't think you can say played off, really. They're certainly being affected by a lot of the same issues. They're struggling for some of the same things like naturalization rights, but they're actually just sort of not being swept up in the same policies.
Great, thank you. So this question is from Nick Foman. How do you see the experience of Japanese Americans during internment being mirrored in terms of long-term effects on the Mexican immigrant community currently being detained by immigration enforcement agencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I won't venture to answer for the long-term effects. I think that if the Japanese American incarceration gives us any kind of roadmap, it certainly tells us that the effects are profound and long lasting. And particularly this issue of family separation is a very devastating one, but there are lots of other downstream consequences. I think there are certainly a fair amount of comparisons. There are groups, most notably Tsuru for Solidarity is a grassroots group that is really drawing these comparisons and doing a lot of activist and educational work around drawing those comparisons and saying that this is something that really should not be, just should not be, period. But I don't know that, you know, coming at it from the perspective of a cultural critic, I don't know that the dialogue is destined to be very similar despite those efforts at comparison, because it's about policing a border. And so, you know, the dialogue of that has been very different from the dialogue around the Japanese American incarceration, which is about people who are already inside the US and also included 2/3 American citizens. And the dialogue around the Japanese American citizens very quickly kind of swallowed up the question of the Japanese Americans who were not permitted to naturalize at that time. So looking at that historically, I don't know that the cultural comparison is going to be very close. But politically, I think we do see a lot of the same factors, and that is why these groups are rising up to voice those comparisons clearly for us.
Yes. So another question, does the model minority rhetoric change based on different racial minority groups? In particular, they're asking here about Indian and South Asian Americans.
Yeah, so here I can give you a very short answer, but I would definitely refer you to some of the scholars who I mentioned at the top of the talk, like Pavan Dhingra. And it does shift. You know, I think that the historical origins again are different, right? The historical origins of the term are very specifically mapped to East Asians and long-standing East Asian communities. So the claiming of that Americanness is very important. And that's done partly in the 1960s through that long history. It's like you have to have been here and been discriminated against enough to have achieved your Americanness. So that obviously inflects differently, not just by ethnicity, but by waves of immigration. That particularly catches up, for example, the Southeast Asian community. Many Southeast Asian ethnicities statistically have much lower incomes. Average income is below the poverty line. And so they don't fit a lot of these model minority stereotypes, and yet the expectations placed on them in educational settings may be the same. And likewise, for South Asian students or South Asian Americans, a lot, again, of these educational, professional expectations on them may be the same, but with a very different history around the image of the community or the policing of immigration. So I think the model minority is the idea where a lot of these perceptions converge. And the problem is, again, that I agree with many of my colleagues that it's an image, it's a history, it's a framework of erasure, and it erases those differences across Asian Americans and different ethnicities, different immigrant statuses, and that is really a huge problem that folks face in terms of accessing services or any kind of support.
So a related question to this is whether or not there's an analog to the model minority myth outside of the United States.
Yes, there certainly are. And, you know, I think that if you look at certain countries that have very diverse populations, you will see that. I think that on the other hand, there are countries that reject multiculturalism as a prevailing framework, where there isn't any kind of idea of a model minority. There's a very different attitude towards minorities in general. There are a lot of comparisons that you could draw. I think that, again, though, I would really stress that the idea of the model minority in the US, its historical origins are so specific to that civil rights era and being used as a tool of anti-Blackness. And that's not something that I want us to forget. And so, you know, if we look at international comparisons, are there minority groups that gain favor by being law-abiding and hardworking and trying to succeed economically? Of course there are, because that is the story of migration and gaining acceptance. But is there a formulation that is exactly like the way the model minority was formulated in the US? That I would hesitate to say, but I think that's a fascinating question.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to go back. This seems like this is a follow-up to the previous question. The questioner asks, I'm curious if heroization or idolization of persons like Mahatma Gandhi impact the perception of racial minorities from Indian origins.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is the case not just for Gandhi, but for the kind of cultural ambassadors that come from many foreign countries. You could even enlarge this outside of Asia, that for domestic populations, those ambassadors from another country have often been hugely influential, right? Just the same in a sense as pop cultural depictions, that may be the thing that people associate with somebody of your background, right? So certainly a towering cultural figure like Gandhi has an enormous effect. In the period that I was focusing on, Madame Chiang Kai-shek came to the US many times, was extremely popular, was able to use her femininity to kind of offset her, her foreignness, and was really able to gain acceptance that way, and in ways that benefited the Chinese American community. So I think that that certainly is a really powerful idea. And right now, I don't know that Gandhi would be the towering figure, but certainly in the time period in which he was best known, I think he did have a profound effect on the way that the South Asian community was perceived. And again, some of that in ways that would have aligned with the model minority as being a man of peace, right? Being perceived as this man of peace, law-abiding, right? Encouraging this kind of peaceful resistance.
Okay. Thanks. So another question from an anonymous attendee. Thank you. Will you please discuss the effects of minority representation or lack thereof in terms of creators of popular media?
Well, that's not a small question. And I'll try to take it in a couple of directions that are grounded a little bit in the material that I covered in the talk. So the idea of this, you know, we have two questions essentially in there, right? So one is about depiction and one is about creation, and of course they're not mutually exclusive. So in the 1950s, this is the era where you really have Asian Americans moving into mainstream cultural production in a significant way. So Jade Snow Wong, the woman who I showed you a picture of in the evening gown, one of San Francisco's most glamorous women, she was one of those people, right? Really moving in. But in this period, she's not writing freely. She's writing for a white audience in a white publishing industry, right? With a white editor. And all of that may be well-meaning, but it's constraining. So there were certainly things she redacted out of her book, not only for her family's safety and privacy, but for the appeal to a mass audience. She redacted a lot of her critiques of white families from when she was in domestic service. So she had some very, very acerbic observations of these families and their social aspirations. So she had to, you know, take many of those out. And so that's obviously a huge constraint, right? Then you look at something like Yellow Claw, where you have on the one hand this kind of hollow Asian American character and this Asian stereotype on the other. It's not created by Asian Americans. And you look at that and you say, well, you know, where is there a place for Asian Americans in this industry? And at the time, there wasn't a significant amount of representation. And we've seen the comic book industry be more thoughtful and purposeful about that, so that some of these characters, not Yellow Claw, who I think doesn't need a reboot, but we've seen a lot of characters rebooted with essentially hashtag own voices, right? So superheroes who are rebooted now with creators of color, by people with that same ethnic background. So you see this kind of effort and this recognition that that isn't just about, again, some kind of political correctness, but that it's about making sure that characters like Jimmy Woo are actually fully fleshed out, right? And that the creator has the experience and the knowledge to bring to bear on that, to make it an actual significant representation.
Thank you. James Thompson would like to ask you about chain migration, about how having ties to a homeland aids success. And I guess I'll add to this whether or not that actually diminishes or abets sort of the creation of the model minority myth.
Yeah, so again, that's a very broad question. And the answer changes in terms of time period, in terms of class. You know, this is also very much sometimes a question that is posited in terms of a contrast to other communities in the US. And, you know, sometimes it comes, I'm not saying this is the case with this questioner, but sometimes it comes with a kind of negative connotation, like that somehow there's this unfair advantage that people have if they've got ties to a homeland that aids success. So there's a lot of kind of loose perception that swirls around this. Again, just to kind of anchor it back to the talk for the rest of the audience, in the 1950s, when you're looking at this, chain migration, very much not a positive, right? Matter of fact, the opposite. So that is the thing that the United States government is most targeting, is this kind of chain migration, this connection to China. This is the most dangerous thing because it's perceived as a possible entry point for communists. And so that's why the extended family, and particularly, I should have specified, the extended family that extends into China is really demonized and seen as this kind of un-American and dangerous family formation. And that's why it's such a surprise when, with the model minority being articulated, it kind of takes a 180 to where an extended family is a great thing. But even there's a difference in that extended family is wholly within the United States, right? So the idea is just that the kids can't get up to trouble because there's always an uncle or an aunt looking out the window at them, right? There's always some responsible family party trying to take care of them. And so that positive view of extended family is actually wholly divorced from chain migration. So if the questioner's intent is to ask about the kind of economic benefits of chain migration, again, that very much depends on a whole host of factors, right? But in terms of cultural perception in this time period, in the 1950s, when the model minority is being set up, it's very much positioned as a negative.
Thanks. So this question is from Peggy Lee, one of our fellows. Thank you for your wonderful talk. I'd like to hear you talk more about the Jimmy Woo comic, which was fascinating. Does Woo gather informants? Does he participate in espionage? Can you talk more about how you situate his complicity in Cold War era US nation building?
So other than that panel that I showed you where Jimmy Woo is walking around Chinatown trying to figure out if the yellow claw has arrived, he actually doesn't really have much in the way of informants. The main informant becomes the niece, who is of course torn between her loyalty to her uncle and her affection, her growing affection for Jimmy Woo. His information tends to magically come to him through the FBI and then just gets funneled to him by his boss. So that, I think, does speak very much to this kind of faith that the comics are bolstering in espionage, right? In our national intelligence forces as this force for good. So really kind of underscoring that national mission. And so he certainly, because of all of these activities that I quickly outlined in Asia and the Pacific, he's very much part of this kind of, if not nation building, at least this kind of sphere of influence building, right? Making sure that the US is the dominant voice, literally, as when he voices the robot, in Asia and the Pacific. So it's very clear. And to be honest with you, when I first started reading the comic, it was a huge surprise to me that he leaves the US so quickly, right? It's like one 3-page story set in Chinatown, and then he just takes off and they never go back to Chinatown. And it's fascinating to think that these white creators, who changed over time, by the way, Yellow Claw was handed off to different people, even though it was just 4 issues, that, you know, this was what they thought that an Asian American should be doing. And I think that does, again, resonate with with what Asian Americans were actually doing in that period, like Jade Snow Wong or the Olympic medalist Sammy Lee, right? That they're being sent to go around Asia and the Pacific. And so, you know, in terms of the actual word complicity, when you work in this time period, as I do, you either have to write them all off as complicit, or you just have to go past that word, right? And look at what they are doing, what they are articulating, and look at the kind of contradictions that they're trying to live through. And that is largely, I think, the tack that I have taken.
So another fellow, Nick Bloom, asks, can you talk a bit about how real racism and hate crimes against model minority subjects, so in this case, he means Asian Americans and Jewish Americans, is being presented to, is presently being used, to justify the growth of police departments, which will probably not serve these communities, but which will likely have a disproportionately bad effect or impact on Black people. Do you see the racial scripts that you've traced out today as being related to this contemporary phenomenon?
You know, this is such a great question. When I was preparing this talk, I was really trying to think if I could take this in that direction to talk about policing. And I think you can. I think Yellow Claw just didn't give me the way to go to it. So I stayed more with immigration. But yeah, you know, again, it's more complicated than that, right? Because the coverage of the anti-Asian attacks, it has not been cohesive, right? It has not been, it honestly hasn't been all that extensive always, and it has been heavily anti-Black, right? A lot of these attacks, the majority of these attacks have not been perpetrated by Black people. They have been perpetrated by white men. And yet the ones that you see, right, the footage that you see is always of Black men, primarily. So I think that we do see, again, that kind of divide and conquer ethos. You know, so yes, I see that racial script, which I think is a great way of putting it, carrying forward. At the same time, you know, the way that the Asians and Asian Americans who were attacked during the last year and a half were described didn't always adhere to the script, right? It wasn't always portraying them as the model minority. As a matter of fact, as with the Atlanta shootings, there was sometimes some distinct questioning of them, right? I think the most sympathy that you saw was for very elderly folks who were attacked. But with the Atlanta shootings, there was this, you know, again, this distinct othering of them by profession, by insinuating that they were involved in sex work, by the headlines focusing on massage parlors, right, instead of saying a small business, you know, all of those things. So that wasn't really clear cut either. And of course, the perpetrator in that case was white. So I think it's, yes, the answer is yes. I do see some of the racial script coming through, but it's been much more complicated than that. I think and that's because we're seeing all of these different factors coming into play.
So Nelson Quezada asks, yesterday, the Senate parliamentarian ruled that the pathway to legalization that Democrats had wanted to pass through reconciliation can't be passed through that method. So the plan was going to include up to 8 million immigrants, shy of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. Do you think that this lack of inclusion for all 11 million immigrants in the plan could possibly be explained by the model minority myth?
Yeah, to some extent. To some extent. I think that I would kind of turn it around rather and say that the way we've been able to gain any acceptance is through the model minority image, right? That there was that kind of, at least some political efficacy in presenting with DACA or with DREAM the idea of this innocent child, right? student in good standing, who had never committed any crimes, right? The crime was committed by their parents. That was the kind of rhetoric that we often heard. And that was something that was used to gain limited acceptance. And so I think it shouldn't surprise us at all when we see an inability to pass any kind of legislation that would grant complete acceptance, because we've never had that. And what I think the model minority shows us is just how we've been able to carve out a very limited acceptance. Although again, looking at the kind of attacks on individuals who disclose their undocumented status, regardless of their incredible academic achievements, you see the limitations of it on that personal level as well.
Yes. So we are getting close to our ending time, but if you do have another question, we could perhaps add one more. Here's the final question that I have right now, and I'll let you know sort of if we get any more in the next couple of minutes. Scott Taylor asks, I want to ask about the origins of model minority as an explicit tool of anti-Blackness. In your view, does the most recent wave of anti-Asian racism weaken the model minority myth among Asian Americans and lead to solidarities with other minority groups, and especially a weakening of the framework's anti-Black origins? Or does the high visibility of Black perpetrators, I think you've kind of addressed some of this already, lead to a deepening of the framework and return it to its divisive origins?
The answer to all of this is yes. All of it, right? It is among some Asian Americans weakening the model minority myth, right? It shows that, again, the model minority myth, in as much as it ever had any protective or political efficacy, it doesn't function, right? It doesn't function enough. And the pandemic, the associations with the coronavirus really blew that open in a very ugly way. And likewise, has it led to solidarity with other minority groups? To some extent, although again, I wouldn't solely credit the anti-Asian racism with that. I think that there has been solidarity among Asian Americans and African Americans and other groups for a very long time, right? And some of the reasons that we don't hear about that history and are not taught that history kind of go back to, the divisive origins of these policies in the first place. So I don't know that, I think that the wave of anti-Asian racism, it did certainly perhaps strengthen solidarity with other minority groups. I think there was some support from other minority groups, although you also saw questioning, right? You also saw, again, these long perceived gaps between different races, different ethnicities in the US. And yes, unfortunately, I think that also there are folks whose anti-Blackness, right, whose racism, which already exists or existed, is furthered by the high publicity that is given to Black perpetrators. So, there's no one answer. It certainly all is happening.
Well, I don't see any more questions, and you've been very gracious in answering these questions and answering them very thoughtfully. So we want to thank you. I wish you could hear our applause, but we're all applauding in the background. So yeah, this has been a great talk. We're so very glad that you were able to share with us. I do want to let everybody know that we're going to do this again, same time, same place next week. Next week, we're going to have another fascinating talk that actually I think it was related to what we've discussed today. So Dr. Catherine Ramirez from UC Santa Cruz is going to be talking about assimilation next week. So I hope that you will join us then. Thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.